This is the Fuji X-T2. It's a 24 megapixel mirrorless camera with a crop sensor, and I've been using it for about 6 months to take landscape photos. So the first thing to say is I've been using Fuji X series cameras for about 2 years. I got this, as I said, about 6 months ago. Before that I was using an X-T1 and an X-T10. And before that I'd been using full frame Nikon cameras. I used a Nikon D800E, before that Nikon D3, and I've been shooting landscapes for about 10 years. So the first thing to talk about very briefly is why I switched from full frame Nikon to Fuji, and mostly it's to do with size. I do a lot of hiking, do a lot of backpacking, carry the cameras up and down cliffs, things like that. And with a full frame system, not only is the camera body bigger and heavier, but so are the lenses. And basically I'd been looking for something that was going to be a lot less bulky, a lot easier to carry around. And the Fuji X system came along, I tried it out, took it to Indonesia for about a month, fell in love with it. Now I wrote about all my experiences about switching from Nikon to Fuji, about traveling with the Fuji for landscape photography with the X-T1 specifically in a blog which I'll link below. So the first question to answer is, do I need full frame and lots of megapixels for landscape photographs? And the short answer is no, you don't, but the long answer is it's a lot more complicated for that. If you're shooting for really big prints, you want to print 2 meters wide, if you're shooting billboards, something like that, or if you're the kind of person who likes to zoom into 100% in Lightroom or Photoshop and look at the incredible detail that the camera is resolving, then probably yes, you want lots of megapixels like a D800 or the new one, D850, or the Canon 5DR, or even the Fuji GFX50, which I was lucky enough to review a few months ago, and it's an amazing camera. But generally speaking, for landscape photographs, do you really need that amount of power? Well, probably not. If you're just going to be printing for magazines or relatively small prints, you don't really need it. For example, this is an article I wrote for a couple of months ago for Australian Photography. There you go. This is a 12 megapixel image shot with a Nikon D90. That's shot with the Fuji X-T1. That's shot with a full frame D3. Then you've got here, that's a D3 panorama. That's a Fuji 16 megapixel. That's a 36 megapixel Nikon D800, and that's a Fuji X series and X-T1. So the reality is that on the page, and the page of a magazine printed, you really can't tell the difference between which camera and how many megapixels I used, and there are 4 or 5 different cameras, 4 different cameras used there. So really, for printing for magazines, printing that big, quite honestly, you simply don't need full frame. You don't need loads and loads of megapixels. It's not really for me, it's not a game changer. I appreciate some people, they may disagree with me, and that's fine. I appreciate some people really feel that they need the megapixels. They like to crop into images. They like really high level of detail. But for me, for the photography that I do, for my purposes, printing for magazines, printing about that big for home site, for my home, or for selling prints to clients, I don't feel any need and I don't feel any loss at not having a mega high performance camera like the GFX 50 or S or whatever. But this review is about the X-T2 and this specific camera, how good it is for landscapes, and basically I'm going to be comparing it a lot with some of the small differences with its predecessor, the X-T1, on my experiences of using this in the field. So first thing to say is that, as I said, I switched because I wanted a smaller, lighter camera. And this is lovely and small. It fits so nice into the hand. The build is great. It really is light. The body is a little bit less than 500 grams. I principally use 2 lenses for landscapes. I use the Fuji 10-24 wide angle, and I use the XF 55-200 is my telephoto. Now, I particularly like this telephoto because it's super small. Fuji make the 50-140 f2, which is a faster lens, but it's also much bigger and heavier. This is really quite sharp and is perfect for me for landscapes, for telephotos. And these two together, they really don't weigh much at all. And along with the X-T2, it's a really small, lightweight kit that I can quite easily just fit into a waist bag. Just for small trips, or if I'm, when I'm traveling, then I'll put the camera kit in an f-stop ICU Pro, where I can fit the entire camera kit along with my Mavic Pro drone, and that's pretty much everything that I'm going to need for my photography purposes for the entire trip. One really small, lightweight package that weighs less than 5 kilos. It also means I can use a smaller, lighter tripod. With the X-T2, I only need something really lightweight. This is the Gitso Traveler. It weighs about It weighs a little bit over a kilogram, whereas before I was using the other tripod that you can see on the left, which was a Gitzo Mountaineer, which was about 600, 700 grams heavier. So in each step, my kit has got smaller and got much lighter, which makes it much easier for me to carry. And that kind of increases the amount of pleasure that I take in landscape photography. I've spent 10 days traveling around Iceland, and we were camping and we were doing a lot of hiking up and down peaks, long distances over the highlands. It really made a difference to me to have a really small, lightweight camera system. And basically, it helps you go that extra few kilometers. When you're sort of slogging up a 400, 500 meter, almost vertical slope, it's really, you're scrambling up. It's just nice to have a much lighter backpack. And for that, I really do like the Fuji system. But being smaller and being lighter doesn't really help for shooting landscapes if you can't depend on it out in the field, if there's any chance it's going to fail, or if the image quality isn't good enough. So the first thing to say about this is that it's a really tough camera. The X-T1 I used for over a year. I took it to Indonesia. I do a lot of coastal shoots. It's got covered in water. It's had waves dropped on it, lots of splashes from waterfalls, and it never failed. Likewise, this camera, I've been using it 6 months now. I've used it loads on the coast, lots of coastal shoots. I took it to Tuscany, where it got a lot of humidity in it. And then I used it in Iceland, where we had sandstorms, we had lots of rain, shot a lot of waterfalls, so it got covered in a lot of spray. And the camera's weather sealing is really, really good. As well as the lenses. Now, the two lenses that I spoke about earlier, they're technically not weather sealed, but I've never had a problem with them with the dust or any kind of moisture getting in. So the body's really great. It fits nicely into the hand. Now, I really do like the controls on the Fuji X series cameras. The exposure compensation, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO and aperture on the lens. They make the whole sort of, certainly with landscape photography where I shoot everything manually, they make the whole process much more tactile. I think I might have said tactile before, but it's just more organic, if that makes sense. Now, comparing this to the old X-T1, they've made quite a few improvements over the dials. The dials are quite a lot deeper, which makes them a little bit easier to move around. The dials also have a lock. The lock works much better on the X-T2, and I find myself moving the lower dial, the drive dial, much less than I did in the X-T1, where it could easily get moved accidentally. So looking at the two cameras together, the X-T1 and the X-T2, you can see the X-T2 is slightly bigger. It's a little bit higher, it's a little bit deeper, the grip's a little bit deeper. It weighs a tiny bit more, like 10 or 20 grams or something like that. And as I said, the dials are all a little bit deeper, which makes it just that tiny bit easier to operate them and to control them with your fingers, particularly when you're wearing gloves if the weather is cold. Now, one of the things that I loved about landscapes with the X-T1, with all the X-series cameras, is the fact that you have this tilt screen, which makes it brilliant if you're shooting with the camera really low to the ground, which is something that I quite often do, particularly when I'm shooting wide. It means that you have to get down on your hands and knees, lay on your belly and stuff like that to look through the viewfinder. But with a tiltable screen, basically you can just look straight down, and it also means that you're much more connected with your environment. Now, I do a lot of coastal shots. I spend a lot of time standing next to waves and stuff like that. When you've got your eye against the viewfinder, it kind of removes you from the environment because you're so focused on what you're seeing through here that you disconnect with a lot of what's going on around you. And when there are waves and things like that coming at you, and if you're shooting wide, you're getting a very distorted perspective of how far away those waves are. You can sort of quite easily have a wave come over you, things like that. It's happened to me a lot of times. Now, with the tilt screen, basically I can look at this and compose and still be very much connected with the environment around me. And the other thing that's great about mirrorless cameras is that you get a live exposure of what you're going to see. So basically, adjusting all the exposure controls on here, you see the image on the back. So you pretty much know exactly what the image is going to look like before you take it. You can see whether it's underexposed, you can see whether it's overexposed, you've got a live view of whether you're clipping your highlights or clipping your shadows. That's fantastic. Now, one thing that the X-T1 didn't have, and an improvement on the X-T2, is the fact that this tilt screen now works in portrait mode. Now, that was something that wasn't there before, and again, I really appreciate it because all of the advantages of the tilt screen I now have when I'm shooting with the camera in portrait mode. It's absolutely fantastic. I also really love an electronic viewfinder. Having used one now, I don't know if I could go back to an optical viewfinder. Again, having all the information, having a live preview of exactly what the shot's going to look like, being able to see exactly what I'm going to see with the image, how exposed it is, what the colors look like. seeing what the highlights are doing, what the shadows are doing, is something that I don't think I could go back to. And of course, with it being an EVF, with it being a digital image, it's the same image that you get there. It's really big and bright, and actually looks brighter than anything that I ever used to see when I was looking through the viewfinder, or the optical viewfinder on my old Nikon cameras. So I really do love the EVF. Other small improvements over the X-T2 are that the doors are all better. Now, it used to be if I stored this in my bag, I'd put my hand in the bag and the battery door would come open. This lock works a lot better now, and also you just push it down and it locks. Before, you had to slide the catch back across to lock it. Same with the battery, it locks when you close it. And another, it's a tiny improvement, which a lot of people wouldn't have noticed, but I really like it, is the fact that the shutter button now has a thread. So you can connect a cable release directly into the shutter button, an old-fashioned mechanical cable release. Now, why is this important? Well, I'll tell you. Because I shoot a lot with an L bracket on my camera, which is great. You connect it into a tripod like that, or you connect it into a tripod like that. You don't have to tilt the tripod over, which unbalances the tripod and makes the camera a lot less steady. The problem with the Fuji cameras, though, is that the cable release connects in this door, which means if you're connected with the bottom of this onto the tripod, you couldn't connect a cable release either. So you basically couldn't use this and the cable release when shooting in portrait mode. But now, because you can connect the cable release directly through the shutter button, that problem's gone away. So it's a small improvement, but for me, it just kind of shows how Fuji really listen to the feedback that they get and try to think of everything to improve the cameras. And it's something I personally really appreciate. Likewise, the bracketing is now improved. You can bracket more than one step either side of the base exposure, which if you're shooting really high dynamic range scenes is something that's really useful. And again, it shows that Fuji have been listening to feedback from people who shoot landscapes with the X-T2 and incorporating as much improvement as possible into the X-T2. Now, one great improvement over the X-T2 is the addition of a second card slot. So now you've got dual SD card slots on the X-T2. Now, these can be configured in different ways. You can have an overflow, so basically you fill up the first card and then it runs onto the second card. You can have them mirrored, so it works as a backup. You've got two identical cards. Or you can have them as I do, where RAW files go onto one card and JPEGs and movie files go onto another card. It's an extremely useful function. Another improvement, which doesn't seem that significant on paper but actually really helps out in the field, is the fact that you can now charge the batteries via USB, and you can get these USB chargers, which means that if you're camping or if you're hiking and you're a long way from power sources, you can now charge the batteries straight from a car charger or from a power pack like this. But what about the image quality? Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's absolutely perfect. I've been using it for about 6 months now in a range of different conditions, and I really do love the images that this camera produces. The colors are incredibly rich, the JPEGs are great, the RAWs are also great. Now, I recently shot an entire hiking book where we only used the JPEGs because the JPEGs were so great, I didn't even need to use the RAW files, but the RAW files are also equally fantastic. Let's just have a look at some of them on my computer so we can look at some of the resolution and the dynamic range that you get in one of the RAW files. Let's have a look at that image quality. Here's a range of images that I've shot with the X-T2 over the last few months. This first one is it's shot with the 10-24 wide angle zoom, and this is a JPEG straight out of the camera, so right away you can get an idea of how rich the color is. Just looking at the detail in the corners, looking at these plants here and at the rocks down below, the detail in the distance. And the detail that it's rendering is more than good enough for the kind of prints that I want to do. If we look at the next image, this is a RAW file. Now I've processed it a little bit in terms of bringing out some contrast, but it's not straight out of the camera. Again, we can zoom in a little bit to 100%, and you can see the level of detail in the fuselage of the canopy. It's really nice. It's a really nice level of shadow and white. It gives really good color tones. Now, there's a tiny little bit of noise in some of the shadows here, but that's basically been put in through the contrast that I've introduced into the camera, and I haven't yet bothered to do any noise reduction on this file. This is another RAW file that I took locally. This is a handheld shot, and it's basically just to give an example of how wide the dynamic range is on the camera. So this is shot at midday in July here in Portugal, so it's right into a very bright midday sun. facing really black shadowed cliffs. So it's about as wide a dynamic range as you can expect to get. And if you look here in the histogram on the left and here on the right, it's just all shadows, all highlights with nothing in between. If I pull out the shadows a little bit, now already you can see that there's quite a bit of detail there, but I can pull out the shadows. Obviously that's ugly, but it does give you an idea of how much detail has actually been recorded. And I'll just pull the shadows back to a reasonable level, something like that, and zoom out of it. And it just gives you really a great idea of how wide the dynamic range is on this camera and what it's capable of pulling in from the shadows to the highlights. The color there is still really rich in the rocks. Now it's not super sharp because this is a handheld shot that I was kind of squatting to get, so the camera wasn't being held really steady. Also, one of the things that I really like is the transition from where the highlights here are very clearly blown out all the way across the sky is really smooth there. It's a really, the camera really deals with light in a very nice way. Now let's have a look at these two images together. Let's compare them side by side. The image on the left, this one, is shot with the Fuji X-T2 and the 10-24 wide angle lens. The image on the right is shot with a GFX with the 23mm prime lens. And they're shot, as you can see from the light, at a very similar time, I think maybe 10 or 15 minutes apart. So zooming into 100%, and you can see when we look at the trees that the image on the left, this X-T2 image, and the GFX image, it is, as you would expect, medium format sensor, 50 megapixels, prime lens is better a little bit, but the difference is so small. I mean, you can see an improvement here in the detail it's pulling out there, but the difference is small enough for me to not really care. That's not a significant difference, and it's not something that I'm going to notice in the kind of prints that I do, unless you're kind of zooming in 100% as we are, or printing really big. Another thing that's nice to note here is that this is Lightroom, and I think it deals with foliage very well. There were issues with the X-T1, with earlier versions of Lightroom, where you get kind of this sort of weird worm effect when you got foliage together. I've not really noticed that with the X-T2 and later versions of Lightroom. It's something that I really don't have a problem with at all. Now, just looking with the telephoto lens, this is shot in Iceland, just to give you an idea of the level of detail that it's pulling out. It's a long exposure, camera is on a tripod, but the detail all across the image here and the shot of the waterfalls, it's about it's a 5-second exposure. The range of shadows, the control of the highlights, the color tones, the blend of the color tones is really nice. And again, this is an image that will look great printed, it's going to look great in a magazine. I'm really happy with that. But just to give a final example of what the camera can do, this was shot with the same lens, with a 55-200mm, but it's a panorama. So I really wanted to get something that I'd be able to print really big, 3 meters wide, and to capture the epic nature of the landscape in front of me. This is taken in the Icelandic highlands around Emströ. So this is a panorama, and it's come out at about 15,000 pixels wide, so it's a very big image. But it just shows when we zoom into 100%, it's taking the computer a while to render that, the incredible detail that I can get here. So if you really do find yourself in a circumstance, as I did here, where you think, right, I'm going to want to print this really big, you can always shoot panoramas. This image, the level of detail in it, the rendering of the color all across the scene is absolutely superb. And for me, the image quality of the X-T2 is more than good enough for any of the purposes that I've got as a professional landscape photographer. Now, another area where Fuji really improved this camera is with the video. Now, if you ever used the video on a Fuji X-T1 or an X-T10, you'll know that it was pretty terrible, to be honest. Shooting HD, you've got all kinds of artifacts, and it was just unusual. I simply couldn't use video on it. This 4K video is really nice. I can show you a quick demonstration here, but really the proof is in the pudding, and I'm recording this video on a Fuji X-T20, which has pretty much the same video as this. So you can really see that it's certainly usable. Is it the best video? I don't know. I haven't used a lot of other video cameras, but to be perfectly honest, the video that I've been able to shoot with the X-T2 looks absolutely great, and I'm really happy with it. So for landscape photography, Fuji X-T2, I can honestly say this is the best camera that I've ever used. Now, I know that that's a bold claim, but I also know that best is a very subjective word. So before you all flame me in the comments saying that the Canon 5DR is much better, or the Nikon D800E is much better, or the Sony A7R2 is much better, that's fine. Photography is always about compromise. There is no perfect camera. Everything is about a compromise and finding what suits your needs best of all. So if you want the absolute best image quality, then you're probably going to be needing a medium format camera with great big lenses, or even a full frame camera. If what you primarily care about is getting the absolute best image quality. However, for me, that's going to limit me in terms of how heavy it is. I carried the GFX for a couple of days with me around Tuscany, and to be honest with you, it was just a pain to use. By the end of the time that I had it, I was sort of quite happy to give it back and switch back to using this. So for me, there's a point of compromise about where everything fits: the size and weight, the usability, the color, the image quality, the resolution, all those things. And for me, that point of where everything falls together is pretty much with this camera, and I honestly don't think I can think of anything to improve it. I think Fuji really hit it out the park when they designed this, and for me, I'm really happy with it, and it's just been a pleasure to use over the last 6 months. So I hope this video has been helpful, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, and once again, and as always, thanks for watching.